The Atlantic slave trade started in the 15th century when European countries were seeking trade routes with Asia, particularly the Spice Islands of Southeast Asia. Just as Spain sponsored Christopher Columbus in his attempt to find a sea route to Asia by sailing to the west, so Prince Henry and the Portuguese hoped to find a sea route to Asia by sailing around the coast of Africa. The Atlantic slave trade was maintained by a triangle that worked between Africa, Europe, and the Americas. Trade goods such as guns and textiles were sent out of Europe and traded in Africa for slaves. The slaves were crammed into ships that crossed the Atlantic in order to provide labor for large plantations in North and South America, which were growing cotton, sugarcane, and tobacco. It ended in the early years of the Industrial Revolution. Cheap raw materials such as cotton produced by slave labor in the Americas were essential. But by the 19th century, continued industrial expansion was dependent on a flexible and mobile labor force. Consequently, many European and American industrialists who supported the slave trade in the 18th century changed their minds when slavery was no longer an economic benefit. People who benefited were British slave ship owners because they made 20 to 50% profit and large sums of money by each ship, and they never left England. It also provided ordinary people many jobs for people back in Britain. Many people who worked in factories sold their goods to West Africa, and sometimes African kings held no particular loyalty to their criminals, so they would sell them so that they could no longer commit crimes in that area.
Europe was able to colonize Africa through the uses of advanced technologies such as rifling and machine guns, and also better political systems. So why did they want to colonize Africa? Take a wild guess.
I love gold!
Africa is very rich in ores such as gold, iron, and coal. This is the main reason why they colonized Africa. The colonization of Africa through European powers greatly changed Africa itself. Africa was Christianized and was also introduced with new technologies and political systems. It also came in a price with the downfalls of the Shanghai, Morocco, Ian, and Zulu empires. It basically changed Africa from a bunch of empires to a bunch of colonies. In the 20th century, Africa was changed from this to this. So how did that happen? After World War II, the great powers of Britain and France won the war, but they were completely bankrupt, and new powers arose such as the United States of America and the Soviet Union, which promoted decolonization. Some colonies became independent diplomatically and others through violent revolutions. One of the biggest legacies of African colonization is the borders of African countries. The borders of African countries were mostly drawn up by European powers when they colonized Africa, and they never changed since. Because of this, the actual borders of African nations don't reflect the actual ethnic groups that live in them. This is one of the main reasons why Africa is such a violent place to live in, because civil war and unrest are caused because of different ethnic groups living in the same place. Because of all the civil unrest and civil wars, Africa is too busy fighting each other instead of trying to develop as a continent and get it out of mass poverty. History has shown that with chaos comes poverty, and with rule of law, government, and order comes prosperity. As of now, most African governments are corrupt and simply cannot restore order in their countries. There are two main reasons behind this. One is because African nations were so used to being governed by European powers, and second is because of all the civil unrest happening because of the European powers deciding the borders of the countries.